I'm Afshin Rattansi, and 14 years to the day that a Labour government took Britain to war in Iraq, killing or displacing or wounding millions. This is Going Underground, coming up in today's show. We speak to the Vice President of Britain's Stop the War movement, George Galloway, as President Trump prepares to meet with Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi in the White House. And
months ago, I'd have said to the party chairman, clarify the situation, make a statement, take responsibility on behalf of the party, and clearly that hasn't happened, and MPs have been left out to dry.
This is a government in normal times in crisis and chaos. Our job is to expose that and make clear that there is an alternative.
Just as the full budget had to go through Cabinet, so the U-turn in the budget should have gone through Cabinet, and it didn't.
We're on the green outside the UK Parliament with Labour, a Tory and a Scottish nationalist. All that coming up, but first, in the early hours of the morning, 14 years ago today, the United States, together with the UK, Australia and Poland, began military operations in Iraq, dubbed Operation Iraqi Liberation, or OIL. This after an overwhelming vote in this place for that invasion. Joining me back in the studio is George Galloway. George, welcome back to Going Underground.
Pleasure.
Let's just begin with you reminding us about your film, The Killings of Tony Blair.
This was crowdfunded, kick-started by crowdfunding. It raised a record amount of money, £165,000. We only asked for 50. So thousands of people wanted to participate in the killings of Tony Blair. I sold my house to finish the film, and it's now doing very well on digital download, on DVD. Not too many cinemas showed it. I've been across the world at film festivals and so on.
Surprising, though, 14 years to the day of the Iraq War, they wouldn't be more interested. Why?
Well, partly the budget that we have to promote it is so really poor that a lot of people as yet don't know that it's there. But it's the kind of film that will last for years. It's never going to be out of date. It is the document of the crimes of Tony Blair. And I think it's rather well done. Certainly, it's been critically very well received. And if you didn't like Tony Blair before you watch it, I promise you, you'll be uncontrollable with anger at the end.
When I talk to Labour backbenchers, a lot of them will say, Iraq is old stuff. The UK Public Administration Committee reporting that Chilcot failed to provide closure on Iraq and that Iraq left an indelible scar in UK politics. Why do you think Blair hasn't been arrested, let alone charged?
Well, Parliament contains a very large number of his supporters on both sides of the House, as Jeremy Corbyn finds out every day. The acolytes of Tony Blair are well dug in the Labour administration, the National Executive Committee, and of course overwhelmingly in Parliament.
They still support the Iraq War?
They do, and Blair still supports it. He wouldn't do anything different in terms of the invasion. He might in terms of the occupation.
Because his point is, again and again, things are better for Iraqis now than they would have been under Saddam Hussein.
Yes, but only a madman believes that. And in our film, the Right Honourable David Davis, now a cabinet member, states explicitly that Iraq was clearly better off before than it is now. There is no Iraq now. It's atomized into fiefdoms, much of it still controlled by ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and its mindset has deeply dug in now in Iraq. You quote them as saying, well, it's old stuff. The killing of 1 million people can't be old stuff. The creation of ISIS cannot be old stuff because we're living with the consequences of it and will do for many decades to come. And of course, it's not just the war, it's the bankrupting of the political class on both sides of the Atlantic, which led to Trump in the United States. It's one of the reasons for Brexit also. They no longer believe when the great and the good tell them something. The men in suits, the experts, opine that this or that is the way to go. People don't believe that anymore. And that's directly related to Iraq. Don't forget that just over 14 years ago, we were 2 million of us on the streets of London. We didn't know then what we know now, that there were no weapons of mass destruction. But we knew in our water that we were being lied to and that no good could come.
Yes, but a majority of the country, and this is related to the hijacking of civil society, as it were. I mean, do you think a prime minister today could do that? Because whatever the size of the march is, 53%, 54% of the time wanted a war in Iraq, according to polls.
Well, they have gone on to do it again and again.
I mean,
they did it in Libya, David Cameron this time, but using exactly the same arguments, echoed by exactly the same journalists and broadcasters. And look how that's turned out. Arguably, Libya is in an even worse state than Iraq at the end of it all, and with more direct consequences for Europe. It's a Mediterranean country. And then Syria. They fanned the flames of extremism. They built a gigantic army of terrorists, many of them foreign fighters, who are all heading back to their own countries. And wait till that happens in substantial numbers. Then we'll realize just how mad our policy in the Middle East has been.
You campaigned against Saddam Hussein, then you campaigned against the war. The president of the Stop the War coalition was Tony Benn. What does it make you feel like when, you just mentioned Libya and Syria there, that his son mooted, still presumably on the backbenches as a rival to Jeremy Corbyn, made speeches lauded by the BBC and the Murdoch press for supporting wars on Libya and Syria?
Well, that was particularly painful, no doubt, although Hilary Benn supported the war at the time, even when his father was the leader of the anti-war movement. I'm not sure what kind of family relations that produced, certainly inconceivable to me. But hey, Labour have funny attitudes on that. One Miliband stabbed the other Miliband in the back, so familial loyalty is not their strong point. It makes me feel even worse, though, when members of Parliament say to me, as many, many did, I wish we'd listened to you over Iraq. I want to say to them, what kind of member of Parliament are you that can be so easily led into such a gigantic disaster? I believe the Iraq War was the biggest mistake since the First World War in British history. And the First World War led ineluctably to our steady weakening as a country. In fact, you can trace the decline of Britain to the First World War. And the invasion and occupation of Iraq is the next biggest blunder and the next biggest crime.
You see, nearly up to today, the 14th anniversary, there was a monument and ceremony for the veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan. Tony Blair was an honoured guest. The Queen said, and I quote, Britain endeavoured to contribute peace and stability to Iraq.
She should never have said that because I don't think that she believes that. Iraq has been utterly destroyed, and the extremism it has brought forth has cascaded around the world, even onto our own streets. So no one in their right mind thinks that we contributed to peace or stability in Iraq. And the Queen should not have said that. Even adding insult to injury, I don't know if you've seen the monument, but the soldier in bronze that's carved, chiseled out there, bears a remarkable resemblance to Tony Blair.
Because you criticise the memorial anyway, even if they had come. What memorial do you think there should be to Britain's war in Iraq?
The only fitting memorial to the Iraq war is Tony Blair on trial. Nothing else will do. And as long as God gives me breath, and after me my many sons, we will never stop until justice has been done.
I should say that your film also makes clear that it's not, of course, just Tony Blair's fault. It's a structure. The memorial you just spoke about is sponsored by BAE Systems and the Murdoch Sun newspaper. Is it still these structures that people should be wary of, let alone the individual?
Yes, because the coup could not have happened if the people in the institutions had not gone along with it. You see, Chilcot had a long parade of people in the civil service, foreign office, the intelligence community, the military, saying that they always knew that this was a bad idea. But they didn't tell us so at the time. And if they had, it might not have gone ahead. In our film, the Honourable former Ambassador Craig Murray quotes the former head of the Middle East desk in the Foreign Office as saying that WMD, the claims, were b****s. he asked him, is it true
Bill
that they've
Beatty
got...
comes on our show quite a bit.
Yes, and he's from Dundee, as I am. A remarkable number of Scottish people in this story. But Sir Bill, as he is now, was asked by Craig Murray, is it true about weapons of mass destruction? And he said, of course not, it's bollocks. Well, that means the very top of the Foreign Office was willfully keeping silent while a Prime Minister lied to the country and to the armed forces whilst leading us into a disaster. And what kind of an intelligence community tells us after the fact that they were wholly against this attack on Iraq and predicted, as I did, exactly what the outcome would be, but did nothing to try and stop it. That's why I call it a coup. It was a hijacking of the Great Britain airliner, and we flew it to destruction.
Arguably, it's a deep state in reverse that Donald Trump faces, because Donald Trump keeps trying to say, anyway, that he was opposed to the Iraq war. Are there forces that are outside his control in the United States that would get him into wars and therefore Britain into wars?
I'm sure about that, and it's remarkable how all these liberals that supported Hillary Clinton are now in open embrace of the likes of John McCain and the CIA and the so-called intelligence community, who used to be described by such liberals as a nest of and burglars and subverters and coup makers. They're now being embraced by liberals as a stick to beat Trump with. What's Trump's flagship policy? Friendship with Russia, an end to the escalation, at least, of tension with Russia. Well, there's a big industry would lose a lot of money and a lot of power and influence if such a reduction in tension took place. The whole military-industrial complex, the intelligence community, the warmongering politicians, they'd all be out of a job one way or another if there was no longer any possibility of military confrontation with Russia. So whether they'll succeed in subverting, wrecking Trump's flagship policy remains to be seen. But that's definitely what they're up to.
George Galloway, thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
After the break, we get the pulse of the UK Parliament after a week of referendum threats, political U-turns, and the largest fine by regulators ever of a British political party. All this and more coming up in part 2 of Going Underground. Welcome back. Well, following a week in which the British Queen assented to Brexit, the government here U-turned on its budget, Scottish and Irish nationalists called for the breakup of the UK, and the largest fine by regulators ever of a British political party, the Tories, we took our cameras outside Parliament to speak to representatives of the Conservatives, Labour and the Scottish National Party. With me now is the former Vice Chair of the Conservative Party, the Conservative MP for the Ribble Valley, Nigel Evans. Nigel, thanks for coming out on the green. Just before we get to Brexit matters, what on earth has the Conservative Party been doing, let alone Theresa May's Chief of Staff, as regards election expenses?
Yeah, I mean, it's not brilliant, let's be fair. But what's happened is that they've used a battle bus to ferry volunteers around the country to help on the election campaigns in certain seats. It should have been part of the National Expenses campaign, and now it's being reinterpreted that it should have been logged as a constituency evaluation. Each MP is allowed to spend about £13,000 to £15,000 per general election campaign, and clearly a number of them have not put it in as to their local expenses because they were told it was a national expense. So the party's now been fined £70,000.
Immediate by-elections? The end of Theresa May?
No.
Corruption?
No, because other parties have also been
this is the largest fine in history.
Well. Yeah, other parties have been fined as well. I think what it means, and other parties use battle buses too, they're all going to have to sit down and rework this through so that when the 2020 general election comes, they will know whether it's a constituency expense or whether it's a national expense. I feel very sorry for the MPs involved. They didn't ask for the battle bus, you know, they're told the battle bus is coming. and they were told it was a national expense. And now, you know, clearly each of them are being interviewed because they didn't include it in their local expenses.
If you feel sorry for the MPs, then
I do. I think they've been let out to dry, and I think the party
by
now,
Theresa May's chief of staff, Nick Timothy.
No, I think the party, that we've got a new party chairman, and I'm rather hoping that he will clarify the situation and take responsibility for the fact that during the general election, it was their battle bus, it was a national expense, it wasn't a local expense.
If you were vice chair of the party still, what would you be saying?
Months ago, I'd have said to the party chairman, clarify the situation, make a statement, take responsibility on behalf of the party, and clearly that hasn't happened, and MPs have been left out to dry.
Well, we can't go into it much further, what with the Crown Prosecution Service and the police now involved. Let's turn to Brexit. What do you think, on reflection, of the antics of the House of Lords as regards Article 50?
Well, they asked the House of Commons to think again over 2 amendments, which we did last week. And we decided by very strong majorities that we didn't want their amendments. We sent it back to them and they conceded. So in many ways, the House of Lords actually worked properly. Had they got involved in a game of ping pong, then that would have been another situation completely. I mean, the party that has been badly treating the electorate have been the Liberal Democrats, and they were the ones that didn't even vote for it on third reading. And they were the ones that were shouting in the House of Lords last week when the House of Lords actually conceded defeat. But the Queen gave royal assent to the bill. It's now an act last Thursday, and now it'll be up for Theresa May over the next few days to make it clear when she's going to trigger Article 50. We can then get on with the negotiations and leave the European Union.
The Lib Dems probably still say they want a second referendum, but was that valuable time lost? We heard David Davis saying there's no contingency plans for no deal being made. Is that because the government were too worried about what the House of Lords were doing?
When David Cameron was Prime Minister, he made it absolutely clear. The referendum was a one-off. It was once in a generation, people to have their say. There was no talk of a second referendum then. The Lib Dems, don't forget, were the party that stopped us having that referendum in the 2010-2015 term. Because of the coalition, Nick Clegg refused to allow David Cameron to hold the referendum in that period. And so I don't think we'll be taking any lectures off the Lib Dems about a second referendum when they stopped the first one happening 5 years ago.
Because I mean, it was Jeremy Corbyn, who of course has come under a lot of flack, who said that your party is in chaos and your government is in chaos. You got the U-turn of Hammond, you got David Davis saying no contingency plan, and then all of this stuff about corruption.
I thought Theresa May's response to him was brilliant. She said, if ever I'm going to take any lessons from the honourable member about chaos, I'll come straight to him. His party is in disarray. When Theresa May announced during Prime Minister's questions that she was reversing the budget decision on national insurance, Jeremy Corbyn was so ill-prepared. He stuck with the same 6 questions that he had prior to the announcement being made. Absolute shambles. And you can just look at the Labour MPs sitting around him. This is a party in absolute disarray. There's absolutely no leadership there whatsoever.
Nigel Evans, thank you. With me is the Treasury spokesman of the SNP, Roger Mullin, the SNP at Westminster. Roger, thanks for coming out on the green. Just before we go to talk about other things, as it were, what did you make of the Electoral Commission appearing to say, you know, when political parties are fined, they might just think it's a price worth paying to win elections in Britain? Is that corruption?
Well, to be honest, I think their comment is absolutely justified. I think really what they were in part saying was the fines they can impose are too small. I mean, the fine is smaller than the amount that the Tories cheated by, which seems very strange indeed. So I think what they have said is perfectly appropriate.
But around the world, it would presumably be seen as buying elections.
Yeah, I agree with that.
You can't say any more than that. Okay, let's go to another impending election, a post-Article 50 election, the independence of Scotland. What did you make of the fact that NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said Scotland would have to reapply to NATO? So you'd have to the Scottish people would have to reapply to NATO and the EU if you get independence.
Well, I thought it was extraordinary. The first thing that I thought was, does that mean that they're going to immediately start removing the Trident naval base, which is a NATO base, and other things? So I cannot see that being anything other than a bit of fancy rhetoric to please their pals at Westminster. I don't think there's any substance to it whatsoever.
I know that the government continually lambasts the SNP over any possible funding of a future independent Scotland. I understand you did ask the Chancellor some questions about his budget.
I asked him a question about his budget, the U-turn that they made suddenly. And I asked them, since the decision we know was made at 8 o'clock in the morning, was this U-turn in the budget put through Cabinet? Because normally a budget gets approved through the Cabinet process. And he admitted that there was only himself and Theresa May made the decision. The Cabinet were kept out of it. So it was like saying, well, we've just dispensed with Cabinet government for the purpose of getting out the mess we've got into. I thought constitutionally it was pretty extraordinary. And in the back of my question, a bit later on, my colleague Alex Salmond raised a point of order with the Speaker about whether this is appropriate to bypass Cabinet.
But on the other hand, Theresa May is the first Lord of the Treasury, presumably Lady of the Treasury.
Well, yes, but there is collective responsibility in a government, particularly over financial matters. Over financial matters, governments carry collective responsibility for all decisions. So it's just as the full budget had to go through Cabinet, so the U-turn in the budget should have gone through Cabinet, and it didn't.
And just another element of this budget that may not have been remarked upon as much as the self-employed tax credits. You appear to believe that Philip Hammond snuck through something about the UK becoming a tax haven without anyone noticing.
Yeah, the Treasury used a little-known device called a legislative reform order to try and create a new form of limited partnership, which is the type of thing I've managed to get an inquiry into because they're susceptible to all sorts of criminality. They tried to sneak that through without it going through the House of Commons, the proper legislative procedure.
That doesn't mean that they're obviously, they want criminality in Britain, but surely...
They want to reduce regulation to make it easier for all sorts of people internationally. We already know that there are people who are rather shady from Ukraine, Moldova and the like have been using UK limited partnerships to hide criminal assets. They now seem to want to create yet another vehicle where it's even easier to abuse, and that's why I've been campaigning to get it stopped. Fortunately, we've managed to get them to put a stay on that until there's a further review undertaken. So I'm submitting more than 40 pages of information on criminality associated with this.
Symptomatic of a post-Brexit tax haven future for Britain?
I certainly think when they were asked in the committee that this order was placed before, why did we need this? And the answer was, so that we remain competitive. And so the question then was, competitive with whom for this type of thing? And Treasury were only able to name two places, the Channel Islands and Luxembourg. If we're having to deregulate because we're afraid of competition in the financial sector from the Channel Islands, it tells you how concerned they are about the post-Brexit world we're in.
Roger Mullen, thank you. Well, with me is the opposition whip, Nick Dakin. Nick, thanks so much for joining us on the Green. We'll ignore the spectacular government U-turn for a second on taxes. Is Labour for Brexit?
Well, we campaigned to remain in the European Union.
Is it now?
We thought that was the right thing to do. But the people have spoken in the referendum result, and I think we have a duty to respect that, and that's why I voted, along with my colleagues, to support the triggering of Article 50. But what people didn't say is what would Brexit look like, and we need to make sure that we have as full as possible access to the single market, to the customs union, and make sure that the jobs of the people I represent aren't damaged by leaving the European Union.
Your leader, elected by the greatest mandate, arguably, of any socialist party in Western Europe, he's always argued against neoliberalism. Ironic that you're hedging your bets there on Brexit, still talking about how you campaign to remain. What's the point of that? Why not embrace it from a Bennite standpoint?
Well, I think we have to embrace it now, and we have to work to make sure we get the best outcome for working people in this country. But that's going to be a real challenge. This trigger is going to take place before the end of this month, and then 2 years the country has to sort out one of the most complicated deals in our history. That's a massive, massive challenge to the government, but it's also a challenge to us. Our job is to try and help the government get a good deal, and that means challenging them in areas where they don't want to be challenged, as well as areas where they probably expect a challenge.
I mentioned Bennite, not least because 3 years ago Tony Benn died, because he wanted us out of the European Union. Is there no understanding within the present Labour Party of a great enthusiasm for Brexit and what it may mean for social justice in this country?
Well, there's clearly enthusiasm to come out of Europe from people who voted for that, but also that a lot of people voted for Remain. 48% of people voted for Remain, and the young people you see on the green today, the majority of them voted to remain in Europe. So there's a big challenge about keeping the country together through this challenge, through these difficult times, and we've got to get an outcome which is in the interests of our country. There are opportunities in that, and we need to take those opportunities, but there are also risks.
Because the Prime Minister appeared to be talking about trade deals like CETA and, again, neoliberal trade deals. Isn't this a chance for Labour to counter by saying Labour has always been against the neoliberal EU myth?
I think we've always had an issue with over-liberalisation. On the other hand, trade is a generator of prosperity, and one of the reasons people today have better lives in terms of more prosperous lives than the generation they came before is because trade has helped do that. And you talk about CETA, for example. That's a good example of a trade deal which is likely to benefit working people across the whole of the European Union, including the UK.
You think CETA is a good thing?
It took 7 years to negotiate.
Even though it may allow courts to rule in favour of American healthcare companies via Canada against the National Health Service?
I think that's the sort of speculation which is unlikely to happen. So it's the sort of scaremongering that people indulge in when they're not focused on the real issues, which is about making the lives of the people that I represent better.
Isn't this the problem with the Labour Party? You're responsible, one of the people responsible for imposing some kind of order. What do you hear amongst the party? Do they really want Corbyn to fight a rearguard action against Brexit?
Well, we need to support the leader's direction and the manifesto commitments that we put in place at the last election, and that's what we are trying to do. We're trying to take the battle to this government. We've just seen the biggest U-turn on a budget since the budget last year. They've U-turned on £4 billion of PIP cuts this time last year. They've just U-turned on £2 billion
this is against the most vulnerable
of NIC cuts this year. So this is a government in normal times in crisis and chaos. Our job is to expose that and make clear that there is an alternative, a better alternative, by supporting the Labour Party.
But what is the alternative? I mean, you're for CETA, so you're with Theresa May on that. Seems to be no difference. And if anything, Jeremy Corbyn was against the U-turn because he was saying that the £2 billion appeared to be saying we've got to balance the budget, not go for Keynesian infrastructural spending.
No, we should be spending. No, we absolutely should be spending this money on investing in skills and investing in infrastructure. That's what we should be doing, and that's the way to generate greater wealth and greater prosperity in the UK, and that's what Labour has been arguing for some time. If I think of it, for example, the steel industry, which is close to my heart, representing a steel town in the area I come from, in Scunthorpe, we need to see more building going on, which benefits infrastructure and brings jobs to that industry.
Nick Dakin, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for the show. We're back on Wednesday when we ask British peer Lord Ahmed about the real reason why tens of millions of people are facing starvation in South Sudan. Till then, keep in touch via social media. We'll see you on Wednesday, 72 years to the day that the Arab League was founded in Egypt.